Welcome, everyone. Really glad that there's so many people who are here to listen to Dr. Kathleen Smythe. She is our guest and our author of the new book, Whole Earth Living, Reconnecting Earth, History, Body, and Mind. My name is Laurie Roche, and I am the co-chair of Bellarmine's Healthy Earth team. And we are supporting this presentation with Xavier University's sustainability programs. Before we begin, and before I introduce Kathleen, I just want to note you are all muted and will remain muted during the presentation. And then at the end of Kathleen's presentation, we'll have about 30 minutes for Q&A. And we do hope that you'll have a lot of questions. And we ask that you put your questions into the chat. I think it'll be a little bit easier for us to manage that way since we have over 60 people. But you can put them into the chat as they occur to you. And then, of course, after the presentation. And we'll do our best to sort of synthesize them and get to as many questions as we can in the latter half of the presentation. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Kathleen Smythe. She teaches history and sustainability at Xavier University, and she's grateful for the opportunity to learn and grow with all her students. Kathleen enjoys participating in our robust local food economy through eating, of course, and through cooking. And she also loves gardening and cultivates a wide variety of plants. Tries to have things in bloom from February to October. So that's a true gardener for you. Kathleen is also an avid hiker and biker, and she didn't put this in her information to me, but she is in fact about ready to release a new book called, with a co-author, a Cincinnati architect named Chris Hanlon, and it's called Bicycling Through Paradise, Historical Rides Around Cincinnati. So that will be coming out very soon. Kathleen is the mother of a 24-year-old son and a 20-year-old daughter, and she treasures witnessing their journeys. So welcome, Kathleen. We look forward to your talk, and thank you for all of you who are here.
Thank you, Laurie, and thanks, Tim, for hosting this. Thanks to everyone who is here. It's wonderful to see some familiar faces, and I look forward to sharing with you a bit about the book, and then the best part for me will be hearing your thoughts and ideas. So I'd like to do 4 things. One, sort of share with you why I wrote the book, what things were sort of percolating for me that caused me to think that it would be a good idea to try to get them all down on paper in some orderly fashion. And then what the main messages of the book are, which is, it's hard to distill that, but I'll do my best. And then why I think it's important, those messages. And then fourth, for this audience particularly, I thought it might be useful to situate the work in the context of Xavier University, of the Jesuit sort of educational mission, and sort of the larger Jesuit Catholic world. So I'll do that at the end. So why did I write this book? It was really to answer a number of questions and to kind of explore a number of things that I thought were connected, but I wasn't sure exactly how. And that's one of the great things about being a professor, is somebody actually pays you to try and wrestle with that stuff and possibly make sense of it. So the big questions that I was really struggling with were like, how did we get to this point that we could completely mess up our home, right? The place that we live, all of the ecosystems upon which we depend. How did we get to the point that we could actually screw all of that up so badly? That was one really big question. And then following on that, how do we get to someplace better? Not just better for us, but better for the earth, better for everyone, not just a subset of humanity or a subset of species. So that was one set of questions, big questions. And then the next sort of set of questions was a little bit smaller, but related. And I've spent a lot of time at Xavier working on developing academic programs around sustainability and sort of campus-wide sustainability efforts. And almost always when somebody's asked for a definition of sustainability, they're either they give a phrase that I should really memorize, but I haven't yet, but you've all heard it. It's something close to make decisions and live currently so that we don't jeopardize future generations in their capacity to live. If it's a picture, it's either a Venn diagram or a triangle with three facets to it, right? One is economics, one is society, and the other is the environment. And these are ubiquitous. You've all seen them, you've all heard them. Sometimes it's people, profit, planet if you're in the business world, but they're very, very common. And I wondered, like, where did these come from? Like, who made these up and when and why? So that was another subset of questions. And as an historian, it seemed like a good question to be asking. And then sort of also I was, and I'll return to this at the end, but I was also spending increasing amount of time in this local food economy. And that's one of the gifts of this region is you can leave the city and be on a farm very, easily. And I happen to live on the northeast corner of the city, and I can, within 4 miles, get to several farms. And so I was spending time literally milking cows and feeding chickens and collecting eggs and doing all of this and finding it really restorative, and yet also not clearly mainstream. And so I had all of that going on as well. And then I wanted to take what I was doing in the classroom, which I'm trained as an African historian. I was increasingly teaching about sustainability, but I've always been drawn to really long-term history. And so when I teach African history, I start with human evolution, which, about 8 million years ago, and I take us up to the present, all in the course of now 1 semester. But I was always struck by how students responded to that long-term view and how unusual it was for them. They were so used to history beginning in the Greek or Roman world, being a couple thousand years old. And when we go back millennia, they were always a little bit disoriented. And I realized in a good way, and the response was usually positive. And I realized, there's something that we're missing by sort of beginning history at some very random, arbitrary marker that is something about the ancient Mediterranean world often. So all of that started to coalesce, and the book then does a number of things. At its foundation, it tries to take this old idea of sustainability, one that I think is very problematic, this triangle, the Venn diagram, this trying not to make decisions that jeopardize the future of future generations. I want to take that and move it off the shelf and replace it with something that I think is much more, one, accessible to anyone, but also I think much more productive in terms of where we need to go. And in order to do that, I have to take this long-term history seriously, and I have to take this question of who we are as a species. Like, we have to take Homo sapiens as our starting point. Who are we? What are we capable of? And particularly, it was important to me, I only have so long to live, and I only have so long to teach. And so if I'm going to be doing this, I better be doing stuff that is actually productive, like can actually happen and change. And so I don't want to spend time trying to change the nature of Homo sapiens. If we've been this way for millennia, I'm not going to mess with that part. I'm going to mess with the part that is changeable, that is mutable. And so that is sort of the foundation of the book, is let's really take this seriously, who we are as a species. And so then within that is, and the place that that I go is to this definition of sustainability. And so I'll start there and then kind of work backwards to some of these ideas that then underpin this new way of thinking about sustainability. These definitions of sustainability that I've mentioned a couple of times, they come out of something called the Brundtland Commission, named for the Norwegian Prime Minister of the same name, that was called by the United Nations in the late 1980s. And their charge was to do two things at once. And it becomes very clear once you understand the history why we have what we have. The two things they were charged with doing was to first tackle the problem of tremendous economic inequality, right? Looking at places in Latin America, the continent of Africa, and saying, wow, they're really, if you want to use these terms, underdeveloped, right? Compared to the United States, compared to Europe. The North versus the South is another way of thinking about it. That we have to tackle. But at the same time, we have to deal with the fact that the Earth is being degraded, that there are some significant environmental challenges that we're facing, right? This is post Rachel Carson, it's post the Environmental Protection Agency in the United States, similar measures taken in Europe, et cetera, in the 1970s. And so the charge was to come up with a blueprint, if you will, for moving forward and solving both of these problems at once. And it was, the report that came out of it was very widely circulated. And if you read it closely, it's very clear that one of those won. And the one that won was dealing with economic inequality. And we know that it won because that triangle takes economics out and separates it and says, if you want sustainability, you have to figure out your economic system, your society, and your environment. And once you pay attention to all three of those, then by some magic formula, you'll get something sustainable, right? What happens when you consider all three of those at once is sustainability. And that's the model that we use to this day to achieve sustainability in almost any capacity. And I think an obvious question is, why would we isolate economics? Why wouldn't we isolate political systems? Why wouldn't we isolate religious systems? Our economic system is a human creation. It doesn't exist outside of human society. We have created our economic systems. Of course, we need materials to subsist, but the way in which we think about those materials has been our construct, not some external sort of thing that prima facie exists. So that is, in a nutshell, sort of the origin of it. And one of the reasons that it won is because for this entire century, our economic models have been developed in an era of, until very recently, and in some ways still, that of fossil fuel dependence, but also a sense of fossil fuel abundance. We've certainly had people saying we're going to run out of fossil fuels, but the foundation of our economy, and if you listen to any politician in the United States to this day, they will never utter the words, right, that we have limits on growth, ever. Because that is the foundational premise, that there is limitlessness to this. And it seemed limitless, certainly in the 30s and the 40s when we were getting oil out of the ground, and when 50s and 60s when we were discovering it in the Middle East and other places, it seemed limitless. And so literally the economic systems that we've built have been divorced from the biophysical world of which they're a part, because we assumed that biophysical world was just going to churn out the energy that we needed forever. And we now know that that calling card is coming up, and that it's not true, and that there's all these other consequences. But that's the fundamental historical reason why it's not working and why economics was isolated. I'll return to all of this at the end. And so then if we sort of back up in history beyond this definition of sustainability, in my research and the way I present it in the book, we come up with some pretty significant hard realities about human nature, human species. One is that we are creatures who have to make our own living, right? That we have to somehow figure out how to get food, how to build our shelter, how to make our own clothing if we live in colder climates. That all of these things are a necessary part of our existence and of our thriving. We happen to be one of the few species on the planet, ants are another, cockroaches are another, that has a huge ecological valence. In other words, we can live almost anywhere. But we can only do that because we have to carry all this stuff around with us, right? The ants and the cockroaches, they're good. They don't need to do all this stuff, but we do, right? And so part of who we are then is this subsistence. We have been gathering food, hunting food for 8 millennia, and we've been growing food for only about 12,000 years. It's a much shorter period of time. But those things that are inherent in getting food, think about the way we taste, think about the way we smell, think about the way we're attracted to a bright red shiny apple. That is hardwired in us. And if you take that out, then you're taking something out of our humanity. And so if you think about the fact that right now in the United States, somewhere on the order of 1.345% of the US population are farmers, and the vast majority of us have nothing to do with farming, except we go to the grocery store to buy food or perhaps to the farmer's market. That grocery store is laid out to play on those evolutionary traits, right? That produce is laid out to attract our attention. So they know that we are still hunting, gathering in some ways, even though we aren't really. And so those are some things that we need to keep in mind. And one of the things that I chart is the losses that we've experienced as we've moved from a society in which we all had subsistence activities. We all contributed to gathering our own food. We all contributed to making a home for ourselves. We all contributed to figuring out our clothing. As we've moved away from that, and in some of these cases, right, we've been away from it for a very long time. We've experienced losses. And I think we have to acknowledge those losses. And one of the things I find with my students is that they can't even articulate, they feel them. They emotionally understand that things are not well with the world or with themselves, but they can't articulate those losses. And so part of this work is to articulate it, to say, this is what we've lost, and this is what we need to regain or reconnect, as the title says. So one of those losses is the loss of our senses. That we simply don't use our senses, our sense of smell, to figure out if the earth is rich, good enough to put a carrot seed in or not. We don't use our eyes to determine whether that piece of fruit is ripe or not, or whether that leaf is from a poisonous plant or not from a poisonous plant. None of that is of quote unquote use to us anymore in a subsistence way. Another thing that comes along with that is, it's obvious, but it needs to be stated, is that we have a loss of labor, that we are not physically engaged. Going to the grocery store, if maybe we're lucky, involves walking. But for most of us, it involves getting in a car, taking the steps to the store, putting things in the cart, and then taking them back home. Nobody's putting a spade in the ground. Nobody's bending over and putting seeds in the ground. Nobody's weeding that field, and nobody's figuring out how to harvest it and then to store it, right? And so that loss of labor is also hugely significant and ties into another element that we try to change about ourselves at our own peril. And that is that we have hands and legs and feet and arms that evolutionarily evolved to actually be useful. And we know from our evolutionary history, if you look at the brain space that the signals from our hands take up, it's approximately a quarter of our brain space, just these guys. which tells us how important they are. And I'm pretty sure that this and this don't really count. But sewing, gardening, making a bed, all of that counts. And there's a brilliant book by Kelly Lambert, who's a neuroscientist. It's called Lifting Depression. And she herself was depressed and was given antidepressants, was on them for some time and thought, this doesn't really seem to be working. And I'm a neuroscientist. I could maybe study this for my own background. And so she did start looking at what happens in the brain. And she writes about the fact that we have a reward circuit in our brain. It's when we release dopamine and all those other positive chemicals. And it is absolutely tied to using our hands for what I call meaningful work. So when we sew, when we garden, when we cook, we release that reward circuit. And this makes complete evolutionary sense, right? If you are taking care of yourself, your brain is going to say, good job, keep doing that. You'll need to do it again tomorrow. And so when we don't do that, then we end up literally depressed. And I think we can all attest to the fact, either personally or people we know, getting in that state. And we have created a culture in which the ideal is essentially to make these and our feet inutile so that we don't have to use them. And then we're surprised when we have high rates of disease, depression, and other things. And so those are two facets that I think we can't mess with. I mean, we are messing with them and the results are not positive. So I think we need to honor those losses and try to recover them, not go back to the past, but recover them. The third then, and this is the area that I tread on with tremendous trepidation. I probably should with all of this, but it's the area of technology. Because and if any of you know me fairly well, I'm like not the person to adopt the most recent gadget of anything. And so I'm in danger of becoming a Luddite. And that is not a useful position. Because if you look at our species evolutionarily, we are a technological creature. We make stuff, we invent stuff, we create stuff. That is who we are, for better or for worse. And so it's one of these things, you can't try to stop it as much as I would like to. And so this is one of those things where you just have to follow the truth wherever it leads. And wherever it leads is we are a technological creature. And so then the question is, okay, now what do we do? And here I find the work of a philosopher, Albert Borgman, very useful. He's retired out of the University of Montana, and he has two ideas that I just think are brilliant for helping us to honor our technological capacities as a species, but then also to say, okay, in its place and in its time. And one of them is something called a focal thing. And his example of a focal thing that he uses in his book and in the sort of articles that are excerpted from his book is very, very outdated, but beautiful. And it's a hearth. And so we can think of like a wood burning stove, perhaps, as something that might be a little more, tangible to some of us. But a hearth, a fireplace. And he uses this and he says, this was, when homes had them, a focal thing. And what he means by that is, focal means it to focus, right? So it focuses the family in all sorts of ways, or the people who live in that house in all sorts of ways. First of all, if that is your source of heat, when you wake up in the morning, it's going to be one of the first things you do. You're going to feed it. So the mornings will be cool. Then as it heats up, you'll warm up. Then in midday, you probably don't pay as much attention to it. You don't need it. As the evening cools off, you have to feed it again and the house warms up, and then you let it go at the end of the day as everybody crawls into bed. So there's a rhythm to the heat that it produces and to the way in which people engage it. That's part of it. But there's also a tremendous amount of labor, right, that goes into chopping the wood, carrying the wood from wherever it's chopped into the stove, making sure that it does stay warm during the times of day when you need it to stay warm. and then the cooking that takes place on the stove, perhaps the clothes washing, the heating up of water for bathing and clothes washing that we used to take place on the stove. And children would probably carry wood, you know, other people would chop the wood, other people would do the cooking, other people would do the clothes washing. So there was a distribution of labor, there was a distribution of time in terms of the way that the hearth worked, and all of this was part of the experience of the people in this house on a daily, seasonal basis. So thus it was a focal thing, and it had all these attenuating circumstances around it. We've replaced that with central heating, central air. It's all gone, right? There's no rhythm to the day, essentially. There's no labor associated with it. Nobody needs to learn how to flip a switch or push a button and turn the heat up or down. There's no training for children, anything like that. So, and I think we can all think of other examples, perhaps, of focal things. Focal practices are, again, the examples that he gives are things like actually running for exercise, which I think is interesting, but cooking a meal. And the key to a focal thing and a focal practice is that both enjoyment and achievement happen at once. What we've done with our modern economy is we've taken them apart. So let's take cooking a meal. If I go to, I don't know, McDonald's for a meal, the achievement that I've done in order to earn the money to buy that meal happened at Xavier weeks ago. The enjoyment of the meal takes place as I purchase, right after I purchase it and as I eat it. If you're cooking a meal, the achievement and the enjoyment are together, that you are achieving a meal for yourself, maybe for others, but you're also enjoying the process. You're right. The sensations are at play, as we talked about. Your labor is there. And so you've brought those two back together. And if you start to think about many of our activities, we've pulled those two apart. And Albert Borgman says, our contentedness, our sense of well-being, is dependent on bringing those two back together, this sense of enjoyment and achievement at once. And he would say, you don't have to do this all the time, and you don't have to give up technology, right? We use knives and blenders and all sorts of things to cook, and that's cool. Nobody's going to take those away from you. We buy running shoes and, you know, fluorescent socks and all the rest, also fine, but they're in their place. They're in service to these activities that bring out more of our humanity rather than stifling our humanity, and that's the difference. So with all of that, then, as sort of an understanding of who we are, and maybe some of the decisions that we've made and things we've done as a culture to create some of these losses, then what I move toward is this new sustainability, I'm not entirely sure what to call it still, but paradigm, way of thinking, way of proceeding. And it rests on the fact that if we look at ourselves evolutionarily, we've been of the earth, interdependent on the earth in three ways over millennia. One is very material, instrumental subsistence, right? We need the earth to eat, for clothing, shelter, all those things that I've mentioned multiple times now. Absolutely true, absolutely necessary, vitally important, but given way more attention than the other two over the last 50 years, particularly, but really over the last 200 years or more since the Industrial Revolution. The other two have had far less emphasis over the last few hundred years, and those are the two that we need to focus on more. One of them is what I call transcendental. It could be spiritual. I think there are a lot of ways of thinking about it, and it has two sides. One is perhaps the dark side, the shadow side, and that is that the earth is powerful and we are weak. We are vulnerable. Hurricanes, tsunamis, too much rain at once, landslides, right? Fill in the blank. And no matter our level of technology, we will be subject to the forces of the earth. And we are a creature that is mortal, right? As much as we would like to use technology to deny that, we are going to die. And that's part of this transcendental nature, right? That something is bigger than us. We don't have complete control. The other piece of it, though, is the positive side or the light side, and it's biophilia. It's what Edward O. Wilson calls biophilia, which means a love of life, right? It's the fact that right now, if you look outside and the grass is green and it's growing tall, we respond to that. We're like, oh, that's beautiful. Well, we respond to that because we evolved in the savannas of Africa with the green grass growing. That's our landscape. When we see a snake or see a stick that looks like a snake, we're terrified. And that's because we also have evolved to be afraid of things that can really hurt us. But we love life. We are lovers of life. And there is so much scientific evidence that this is hardwired in us. We perform better when we're in buildings with daylight. Students do better, teachers do better, workers do better. There's fewer sick days, on and on and on. If you look at studies of people who are in hospitals and recovering, if they are in a hospital room with a view, with a window, first of all, and a view of a tree, they tend to be released 24 to 48 hours earlier than patients in rooms without a view of a tree. Neighborhoods with access to trees have lower crime rates than neighborhoods without access to trees. This is all just crystal clear evidence that we are hardwired to be of nature. Like this, we are one with this stuff, right? That our well-being is tied up with it. So that's the transcendental part. And then the third part, the one that I find the most fascinating, and I think the hardest to really wrap our minds around because we're so far from it here, most of us in the United States, is what I call a cultural relationship. And this has a ton of different layers. I'll just give you a couple of examples. One layer is the most basic level, and that is the breath that I'm using to speak to you is the same as the air around me, right? I'm using that air to communicate this to you. And when you ask me questions, you'll be doing the same thing. The language that we use, originally, it was a symbolic language. It was taken from the world around us and converted into ideas that we wanted to communicate. We now have an alphabet that's got no resemblance to anything around us, and it's abstract. But we have taken that journey as a species from very, very concrete, tied to the world around us, to much more abstract. And just as a really interesting note, IQ scores are going up. And the reason they're going up is because we as a species are becoming more and more abstract thinkers. We're getting better and better and better at that. So we're getting better and better at the IQ test. So, but the other example of this is that in most pre-industrial cultures, there was a tie to the land that was essential. And it's kept in stories and in moral tales and all sorts of things like that. When I would walk the landscape with people in Tanzania when I was doing my field work, like everywhere there was history. They're like, oh, over there, that's where my great grandmother did this, or over there, that's where they say, the gods came out of the earth and this society started. And, over there, that's where they used to work iron. And the landscape was history. There was no disconnection between the two. But there was also usually stories associated with the landscape. And the book that does this the best, that's just a brilliant book, is called Wisdom Sits in Places by Keith Basso. And it's about the Apache in the American Southwest. And he talks about the fact that the Apache have all these place names. So where water runs through two gray rocks, or where the two cottonwood trees stand up tall, right? They've got dozens and dozens of these place names. And these place names carry stories with them. And if somebody makes a mistake, like, oh, I don't know, a teenager, for example, right? Then all an elder in that society has to do is to say, where the two cottonwood trees stand up straight. And that youth knows exactly what they've done wrong and why it's wrong and what the society expects them to do to correct it. Because encoded in that place name is their morality and is the history of their society. And so Keith Basso talks about the fact that uncles and grandmothers die, but the landscape lives on, right? And so the history is held in that landscape. So those are the three pieces, then the instrumental or the material, the cultural, and then the transcendental. These are the ways we're of the earth, and we have to have all three of them, and they have to be in balance in a way that they aren't right now. Once we have those in balance, then we can think about sustainability, and not just for ourselves, but for the planet, of which we are a teeny part. And so I propose that we, instead of a triangle, instead of a Venn diagram, that we have a set of nested circles. The bottom circle is the earth, right? Fundamental, that's where we start. Then the next one, and this is my contribution, these nested circles are also used by ecological economists, but they don't have this middle piece. The next middle piece is human nature. We have to honor human nature. We have to honor these three pieces. We have to honor the losses. We have to honor who we are as a species. And then finally, on top of that, we can build our society. And of course, economics is in there, but so is our political system, so is our religious system, so are our cultural systems. They're all in there at that very top together. Economics does not have a place outside of that piece. So that's the proposal that I make in the book, and some of the reasons why I make it. So I will finish with two much shorter sections. So one, why does it matter? I think there, for most of you here, probably this isn't obvious. There are some obvious answers to this, but I'm hoping to give you a few answers that might not be quite so obvious. One is, I think, that we can end up in a place that I think the Jesuits would appreciate, right? Which is where we think of vocation, we think of how we go about our lives in a way that is meaningful. We have meaningful work and we have meaningful lives. They're not work and lives that are disoriented from the earth, that are jeopardizing the earth, but they are of the earth. And that we can start to think about our future in a way that is, doesn't cause us to feel this moral anxiety and sort of like we're being torn apart. Like, well, I have to earn a living, but it's at the expense of this. Like those two can be brought together. I think that another outcome of this is that we are encouraged, just as I encourage my students to do in classes, to think about the really long term. And one of the coolest things that I've come across of people who are doing this right now is a group of people called the Long Now Foundation. And I shamelessly steal their title for one of the chapters in the book. But the long now is 10,000 years. It's the period of time we've been farmers. And the Long Now Foundation does a whole bunch of things, some of them very bizarre. But the project that they launched that sort of gave them the original idea is they're building a clock that will keep time for 10,000 years. And one of the ways that they talk about this project is, if you ask a lot of youth today, they will likely tell you they don't have a tremendous amount of hope for the future. And if you build a clock that's going to tick for 10,000 years, somebody is saying there's going to be a future for 10,000 years, just like there's been a past for 10,000 years. And so that's part of this sort of bold moving into the future, right? Like, yes, we are going to do this. Yes, we do have this capacity. And it's this long-term thinking that is also part of who we are. I mean, if we think about some of the things we've undertaken as a species, in Europe, we built cathedrals, not in 1 year or a decade, but over hundreds of years, some of these cathedrals, right? Now that's a project. A community decides we're going to build this thing, and they keep it going generation after generation after generation after generation. There's other things that I think are even more accessible to us. I was really privileged to be up in Dayton when the Solar Impulse 2 flew in, which is the second solar powered airplane to circumnavigate the world. And of course, they flew into Dayton because of the Wright brothers. But, they flew in at 10 o'clock at night. And I don't know, there were maybe 500 of us up there waiting for this thing to land. And they had a pit crew of all these 20 somethings who were just like jazzed beyond belief that this plane was landing there. And it circumnavigated the world, but you could only fit one person in it, and that person had to stay awake for 18 to 24 hours. Right? This is not commercially viable yet. But when the Wright brothers flew their first flights, that's exactly what people said. This is not commercially viable. You guys are nuts. And so this is the kind of thinking and sort of long-term projects that we all, I think, need to be a part of. We need to know that something we're engaged in now, we're not going to figure it out in our lifetimes. It's going to be figured out 3, 4, 5 lifetimes from us. But that's it. That's what we should be spending our time on. Those are the worthy projects, not the ones that we can get done next year. Those aren't going to be the ones that are going to carry us forward. And there's lots of examples I could give you, but we'll stop there. And then the final, I think, implication and reason that this is important is, and this is the last chapter in the book. And again, I steal shamelessly from Wes Jackson for the title for this chapter. He's the founder of the Land Institute. And I call the last chapter Education for Homecoming. Because we in higher ed, myself included, are guilty of selling a product that is really meant and has done tremendous damage to families, to societies, and to communities. Because the idea is that you get this education and then you leave. The opportunities are elsewhere, right? You don't want to stay in this small rural town if you can go to college and then go on to Chicago. Why would you ever want to come back here? And as I've started to talk to my students about this, I'll have 2 or 3 students in every class who are like, yeah, that's the message I got. Don't come back. There's nothing for you here. And this literally is the point of our education, right? Our industrial education was to make people for an urban industrial system. And so somehow we have to start educating so people can think of where they are as the best place to be and all the things that they could do to make that place as good as any other place. So those are some reasons why I think it's important. And the last thing I want to do is just kind of wrap it up by saying a little bit about this project is definitely of Xavier and of Cincinnati. It's of me first, but I am now, I've lived here longer than I've lived anywhere else in my life. And there are ways in which this project is very much a product of my being at Xavier and my being in the larger Cincinnati community. And I think one of the things that led up to the project was, as I was doing that farm work and as I was teaching my students, I was realizing that I was compensating. So in the classroom, I was talking about all these ideas and all these problems and all these challenges. But in my own free time, I was trying to do things that were restoring my hope and my humanity, really. But I was terrified to tell my students about them. I mean, terrified. I was like, they'll think I'm nuts. That I milk a cow once a week? Like, I can't tell them that. But as soon as I was able to tell them that, and the Jesuit mission helped, I mean, there was just this constant drumbeat of cura personalis, right? You're a whole person, and I was like, Kathleen, you're not presenting a whole person. And so that for me, I had to connect those two, had to have the courage to connect those two in the classroom before I could really start connecting them for myself and then working through them in this book. And so that's a great gift that Xavier has given me. And then I think, some of the connections sort of after the book was written are obvious, right? I mean, reconnecting Earth, history, body, mind, that's integral ecology, right? That's Pope Francis's call for integral ecology. I think it's another way of approaching it and thinking about it, but they're cousins, very, very much, I think, if that's not too bold of me to say. And then obviously the universal apostolic preferences that the Jesuits came out with a few years ago, they're all deeply interconnected, but boy, number 3, accompanying our youth for a hope-filled future, and 4, caring for our common home. this book comes out of my trying to figure out how to live a hope-filled future and trying to transmit that to my students in the classes that I teach and in the things that I have them read and work through. So all of that suggests to me that this is very much a product of this very special place. And I appreciate Tim and Lori the opportunity, and all of you for listening to me I didn't think I was going to take this long. So I will stop there, and I look forward to hearing from you.
Kathleen, thank you so much. There's so many ideas here, and I think it also takes a historian and someone with a long view. One of the many things that I was struck by in your talk was the students' fascination with history going back to evolutionary history, early humans, way before we typically, because it's not something we know much about, and reconnecting to that. And also the poignant sense of the students being unaware of what they have lost. And I guess maybe that's true of all of us, this sense of feeling disconnected. This is a question that sort of towards the end of your talk, when you were talking about taking a really long view, there's this Oscar Romero prayer that we are workers and not master builders, ministers, not messiahs. We are prophets of a future, not our own. Perhaps you're familiar with it. It's a really wonderful prayer. So do you see prophetic edges of our spiritual and sustainable lives at present, locally, nationally, globally, things? How do we act as prophets, especially when, as you said at the beginning, the idea of placing limits on ourselves, or some of the ideas are just not too welcome by people. And yet, even taking a long view, we are in some ways running out of time in regard to climate change. So it's difficult to be a prophet in these times. Do you have some thoughts on that?
It's a great question. I'm not sure I have, anything, no pun intended, earth shattering, but certainly, I think that one of the things that the long now suggests is courage, right? And I think one of the hardest things for us to muster is courage in the face of uncertainty. And we've all had a big walloping dose of that over the last year. And I'm not, I think we're going to have a lot more walloping doses of it as we, encounter things that are yet to come. And I think, one of the things I talk about in the book is that the whole time that we developed agriculture, so from 10,000, 12,000 years ago until very recently, is known as the geological era of the Holocene. And it was remarkably stable climate-wise, remarkably stable compared to what came before and compared to what we're about to face. And so we have a new geological era now that is the Anthropocene. And it's marked by human action on the planet. We're basically now the equivalent of geological force is what this is telling us. And so this uncertainty it's with us. And in some ways we've created it. And so, yes, I think that just mustering the courage, and that the practices, whatever practices you find, and there's all sorts of practices I haven't talked about that I'm sure many of you are engaged in, whether they're spiritual practices or other practices. I happen to find digging in the dirt and, things like that to be the ones that restore me. But we have to be able to do both, right? We have to be able to restore ourselves and then have the courage to think really big and long about how we're going to restore our communities and our planet.
One of the people is asking, I'm wondering if students on any field trips to help them reconnect to the land, or perhaps to.
I do. I am just finishing this semester a history of agriculture course. And I have my students work on farms for 15 hours throughout the semester. And so they're on 7 different locations, one of which Tim helped me connect to, the brick gardens that we use for our community garden at Xavier. I also, we were talking about this earlier as we were prepping the session, but I also teach a bicycling class that was really the beginning of the book that Lori mentioned that's about to come out. And students spend 8 days, 4 hours for each day, touring the greater Cincinnati region by bicycle and learning about Native American history, about early European history, about our rivers and floodplains, and about recent attempts made by people and organizations to live more sustainably. And so it's this very kind of higgledy-piggledy, all that gets thrown together and not necessarily a very coherent fashion initially. And students get a chance to kind of sort through that and figure out what it's like to learn outside of the classroom and learn with their bodies, because they have to go up the hills and down the hills, and it's not always great weather, and et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, I think that's absolutely essential that we provide students these kinds of opportunities. And partly I do that so that they love this place. They're going to be here for 4 years. And even students who are from Cincinnati, when they do the final presentation, they say things like, I hadn't been to most of these places, or I'd been, but I didn't see what we saw. Or, when my parents want to do something, I take them where we go on our bikes and I show them this stuff because I didn't know where to take them. So it makes a difference. They do learn to love where they live, just as I have.
It's interesting because somebody else asked if you were finding that these bike trips and field trips help encourage the students to stay here after they graduate.
That's a good question. I have only anecdotal evidence. But yeah, I mean, students have said, I never would have even considered staying here until I had this class, because now I feel like I know this place, but I couldn't tell you, long term what the impact is. I haven't been tracking that, but I would think it would be an outcome, certainly.
Yeah, I mean, the more familiar you are with the place and get off a college campus, the more you think it might have to offer for you. Most of us here on this call are affiliated with Bellarmine or Xavier, so Catholic institutions. And I'm wondering, surely you've given some thought to what traditional Catholic and Christian teaching in general how it has contributed to this disconnection with the earth, our sense of perhaps dominion over other species, the preeminence of the human species, and what that means for non-human creatures. So in what ways has that traditional teaching been harmful, and in what ways does it kind of hold us back in trying to move to a more connected prophetic vision? And in the same way, how can that teaching help us to live more harmoniously with the earth?
Those are really big questions. And one of the critiques of the argument that I'm making, and are similar arguments that other people make, right, about definition of sustainability that's anthropocentric, right, that has humans at the heart of it, is that well, gosh, what about all the other species on the planet? The reality is that we have the power and they don't. And that's why an anthropocentric model is necessary. I mean, I'd love to have a model that wasn't anthropocentric, but I'm sorry, the jellyfish aren't going to figure this out. Like, we have to figure this out. And so, I think that's the double-edged sword with the dominion thing, right? Is that, yeah, in some sense, this is true, but it also is a very deep danger, and we understand now better perhaps than ever before what that danger is. And I guess, but that's partly why for me the book is so hopeful, is when that dominion turns dark, we turn dark, right? Like we're not satisfying our deepest needs. And I don't think it's Pollyannish to say that the reverse is true. You know, like we, if we all could grow a tomato, I'm pretty sure we wouldn't need to be at the shopping mall quite as much. You know, I think there's a direct connection. um, so
We have a comment that we call things fossil fuels because they are dead. What are the prospects of powering the planet with living things like the sun and wind? Isn't the future about looking up, not down? It's interesting because I just started a book, and some of your book reminds me of it, called Underland by Robert McFarlane. And it's all about what lies beneath the earth. So there is some looking down too, because we know that the soil and what's underneath the soil is the foundation of our life.
mhm,
And as you've been talking about this whole time,
right.
and we've ignored it because it's unseen. So it actually can, we need to keep the fossil fuels in the ground and use the ground to sequester the fossil fuels that we're throwing up into the atmosphere, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you know, yes, we do need to pay very much attention to the soils. I think the question of, you know, of fossil fuels, obviously we need energy, right? That's not a debatable item. There's a lot of evidence that demonstrates that countries like Costa Rica and I can't think of some others that are in that category right now, but the energy per capita that they use is just a fraction of our energy per capita, and yet their well-being is very close to ours. And so I think that's the nut we have to crack is, you know, we're not going back to everybody's being hunters and gatherers. Like that's not happening. You know, we have to figure it out where we are now. And that's part of the solution is to learn from people who have figured out how to achieve a very high standard of living, with far, far, far less energy use and far less destruction of the soil, both of them.
How do you or would you advise someone who sees the benefit in living more locally and community-based, and also sees the restorative and enriching benefits of traveling, studying, and connecting internationally? How did you integrate your background in African history and research with your current focus?
This is a really, really, really hard question. And I mean, I am as inconsistent and as deeply what um, guilty as anyone else for using far more than my share of fossil fuels, particularly traveling. Um, and you know, I think about all of the people that I really admire: Wendell Berry, Wes Jackson, right? All these people left home, like they left, like they went somewhere else and they did something else and then they came back. And there is absolutely something very profound about leaving and looking back on where you've come from in order to understand who you are in a deeper and stronger way. And certainly that was my experience. I learned so much about myself by living in Kenya and Tanzania. So yeah, it's a, you know, I think about this all the time because this is another aspect of human nature. Like we travel, right? We are a migratory species. We move. That's who we are. Um, and so it's unrealistic to say, okay, everybody. Well, I actually have a great story. I It was sixth, seventh year at Xavier. There was a Amish farmer, David Klein. I'd never heard of him before, but he's actually very prolific. He's written a ton of books. He came to speak, and I was invited to eat lunch with him. And so I was being introduced. He'd given the speech the night before. I was being introduced to him at lunch by somebody who said, "David, this is Kathleen Smythe. She's about to take 9 students to Ghana." David Klein pauses for a very long time and looks at me and goes, "Huh, There are 3 places within 6 miles of my house that I haven't visited yet. That was it. And I got his message, right? Um, and so his critique was, you're wasting your time and our energy and all sorts of other things, right? Taking these students to Africa, and just keep them here, right? There's enough to explore right here. So I think there's a truth all around. He's right. And I think we can achieve many of the same things by being a little more mindful about the differences within a much, much smaller radius. So I don't have the answer. It's complicated.
Do you incorporate any teachings from Laudato Si with your students?
I have. I did not this semester, but I have in the past, yes, used passages or sections of Laudato Si with my students, yes. And generally they respond very, very positively to it. It's actually surprising to me how many times I bring up things about the Jesuit mission, or that students say they don't get a lot of it in their classes. Certainly in theology classes they do, and they expect it there. But if you're outside of that department, they don't encounter it very often. And so for the most part, even if they're not Catholic, I think, they chose to come here for a reason, and they kind of expect this to be part of what's on offer.
Kathleen, are there either spiritual or not spiritual practices that you recommend to your students when I think many of them, certainly I feel it, I've heard the term climate grief, and it's good to have hope and to use actions to have hope, but I think there's a certain amount of grief, and I'm an older person, but I have children and grandchildren, and while I feel grief for all of our losses, but are there things that practices that you do, perhaps if you also suffer from climate grief, or other people have anxiety, I tend to be more grieving over it, things that we can do that are either actions or spiritual practices that can help us to stay engaged and move forward, even if we're feeling loss?
That's a great question. I actually had a student it was just last semester, this has been a long year, who said she was angry. She was very angry. And she said, I am so tired of being told to be hopeful. She said, I get that message in every single class. I'm not hopeful. She said, I'm sad and I'm upset and I'm worried. But hopeful is not the term to describe what I feel. And she felt like it's sort of being shoved down her throat, particularly with the universal apostolic preferences, I think. And, she really wanted someone to kind of validate that grief. And certainly I try to let students know that it's there's grief, there's fear, there's uncertainty, and I feel all of it. And it's hard, and that we just sort of have to stand in the face of it. It's Joanna Macy, right? We've got to accept that that's part of it. And that it's very unfair to our students to not acknowledge that piece of it and only to focus on the hope part of it, because they're part of the same experience. And gosh, you can only grieve something that you love. And we don't, as Pope Francis says, we only have one heart, right? Mm-hmm. And so if we shut it down and try to paper over the negative, then we're not going to experience the positive either. Yeah. We
have a comment, and we'll wrap it up quickly here. Maybe one more question or a comment, but someone says, Joanna Macy says, the other side of the coin of climate grief is our great abiding love of the earth. And that does, I also saw, there's a documentary about Greta Thunberg, and I saw part of it last night, and she gets asked questions all the time because she seems like this angry young woman and young teenager. And she said, well, you can take actions even if you don't have hope sometimes. And then the action builds the hope, that you can't have hope without action. And so just sort of moving ahead and doing many of the things that you've talked about today, and then many of the things that those of us on this meeting do to reconnect with the earth are some form of action, and that gives us some hope. And all we can do is just keep moving forward and looking back into the deep time. So if I think that we will wrap it up here, and I want to thank you so much, Kathleen, for your time and for helping us to look at our disconnectedness and to see how we might be more connected to our past, to our humanity, to our bodies, to our hands and feet. And I also thank everyone who joined us this evening. So this presentation, we've been recording it, and it'll be available on Bellarmine's YouTube channel. And so feel free to share that with others. I also wanted to say that if you would like to go deeper into whole earth living and its implications, Kathleen has agreed to co-facilitate a book group discussion for us. And that would be in August. So you have 3 months to read the book, and you can get it. Kathleen has copies, and Tim Severin has copies for $16. We have about 15 left. So if there's a run on them, they're also available via Amazon. So let us know, let Tim know if you're interested, and we will form a book discussion group so that we can take a deeper dive later this summer. And lastly, I wanted to let all of you a reminder, our Healthy Earth team has compiled and updated a list of all kinds of resources. There's wonderful books. We need to add Kathleen's book to the list, both of her new books, and all kinds of stuff, from lifestyle to reading to movies to videos to things you can do with your family, to ways to connect. So Tim has put his email into the chat, so you can email him to get a copy of the book. And he's also, I think, Tim, you're putting in the link, to the Healthy Earth team resources to like. So thank you for joining us. Tomorrow is the last day of Earth Month, but we don't celebrate just 1 month, this group. We never stop. Earth Month goes on. And stay safe. Thank you all for joining us so much.
Thank you.